The morning she hauled the first load of limestone up from the creek bed, it was a Tuesday, the 4th of October, 1987, and the sky had gone the color of old pewter by 7 o'clock, the kind of low, pressed-down gray that sits on the ridgeline and doesn't move, and you knew from that sky, if you'd lived on that particular stretch of ground long enough to know anything at all, that the warm days were finished and whatever was coming next was coming with intention. She had borrowed my father's flatbed that morning, the old one, the 68 with the cracked left mirror and the hydraulic lift that worked about 60% of the time, and she'd driven it down the two-track behind the lower pasture to where Garrison Creek made its bend around the limestone shelf, and she'd loaded that truck by hand, not with equipment, not with a skid loader or a tractor bucket. By hand, one rock at a time, the way her grandmother had always said you had to do it if you wanted to understand what you were building. I remember watching her come back up the hill with that first load, maybe 1.5 tons of flat limestone stacked in the bed of that truck, and thinking she looked like a woman who had made up her mind about something the rest of us hadn't caught up to yet. I didn't know then what the rock knew. I want to be honest about that from the start. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I farm the ground that adjoins the south end of her property, have for going on 41 years, and I knew her family the way you know people out here, which is to say, I knew her grandfather Harold before I knew her father Raymond before she was old enough to drive, and had watched that farm pass through 3 generations of people who all understood something about that particular 80 acres that most passers-by would never have guessed from the road. The farm sat on a low shelf of ground between 2 creeks, oriented in a way that left its north and northwest faces completely open to whatever the plains decided to send down in November and December and January. There was no natural tree cover on the north side. There never had been. Harold had tried a shelter belt of cottonwoods back in the early 1950s, and they'd done tolerably well for about a dozen years before a late April ice storm took most of them down to the ground. Raymond had replaced some of those with a line of eastern red cedar in 1971, and the cedar had grown in slow and patchy, and by the middle of the 1980s there were maybe 20 trees still standing along that north fence, spread across roughly 400 feet of exposure, and they were not enough. They had never been enough. Every farmer in a 5-mile radius knew that the weakness of that farm was its north face, and most of them, if you asked them plainly, would have told you that no amount of tinkering was going to change that, because you cannot outwork the geography of a place, and the geography of that place said, the wind owns this. She had inherited the farm in March of 1987, when her father Raymond passed at 63, and she was 31 years old, and she had been living in town, working at the grain elevator. And most people who saw her pull up to that farmstead for the first time, as the legal owner of it, assumed she would list it with the county realty office inside of 6 months. It was not a cruel assumption. It was the kind of assumption that accumulates around a farm when the last person who truly knew it is gone, and the next person in line is young and alone and facing an 80-acre obligation with a north face that hemorrhaged heat every winter. The neighbor on the other side of her, a man named Denton, who ran a clean operation and drove a truck that never seemed to accumulate mud in the wheel wells the way working trucks do, stopped by the second week of April and told her plainly, not unkindly, that she might want to consider what the property was worth before she sank money into it. He said it in the way people out here deliver uncomfortable truths, which is to say, he leaned against his truck door and looked at the tree line and said it sideways, not at her. She told him she appreciated it, and then she stayed. By June, she had moved in full time. By August, she had the cattle watered and the fences tight, and the barn roof patched where Raymond had put it off for 2 seasons. By September, she had done enough to earn a kind of neutral respect from the people who watch such things, the people who tally up a new farmer's first season decisions without ever saying so out loud. And then in October, she started hauling rock from the creek bed and stacking it along the north face of the main outbuildings, and the neutral respect curdled almost immediately into a particular kind of polite bewilderment that out here sometimes passes for concern. By noon of the first hauling day, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown by the time it got to the far end of the counter. The version said she was stacking rock for a windbreak. The version said it like that meant something about her judgment. I want to say something about that because it matters to what came later. The people who doubted her were not fools. They were experienced. Denton had been farming for 30 years. The extension agent who drove out in late October with a clipboard and a soil report was a competent man who had spent 4 years getting his degree and another decade learning how the county's weather actually behaved, which is a different curriculum entirely. The man at the equipment rental place who told her she'd be better served spending that time installing steel windscreen panels on the barn had priced and installed those panels on a dozen properties, and they worked. None of these people were wrong in the way that ignores evidence. They were wrong in the particular way that comes from having enough experience to be certain without having quite enough patience to be right. The difference between those two things is thinner than it sounds. What she was building, as I would come to understand it, was not exactly what any of them were picturing when they heard the word windbreak. She was not stacking rocks the way a child stacks blocks, randomly and for height. She was reading something. She was following a design that was not hers, not originally, and that is where the story turns from a story about stubbornness into a story about something older and quieter and more worth your time. She had found her grandmother's notebook in April, the same week she moved in. It was in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the east bedroom, underneath a wool blanket and a stack of hand-sewn quilting squares. And it was a marbled composition book, the old kind with the black and white cover, gone soft at the corners, and it was written in her grandmother Vera's hand. Vera had come to that farm in 1939 as a 19-year-old bride and had lived on it for 47 years, and she had written in that notebook the way a person writes when they believe the writing matters, which is carefully and without wasted words. She had written about soils and about the behavior of the creek in wet years and dry years, and about where the frost came first and where it came last, and about which animals seemed uneasy before a storm, and which ones didn't register the weather until it was already on them. She had written about the north face of that property the way someone writes about a problem they have turned over in their mind for decades without resolving it. And on the 43rd page, in pencil that had gone brown with time, there was a passage that she had underlined twice and followed with a question mark in the margin. The passage said, "Limestone stacked dry to 7 feet on a 9-degree batter will hold the wind off the barn wall better than any living thing I have tried, and the question is only whether a person has the winter to do it right, and the patience not to rush the base." She had told me about finding that page in June when we were both walking the fence line between our properties, and she was telling me about the notebook in the way people tell you about something that has decided them, not looking for your opinion, but letting you witness the decision. I had listened the way I listen, which is without hurrying her. I had not said much. I will own that I did not, in that moment, fully understand what a 9-degree batter meant in practical terms, or how high 7 feet of dry stacked limestone actually stands when you are building not a garden wall, but a wind structure along 260 feet of north-facing exposure. The numbers were there. I just hadn't done the arithmetic yet. That was my own version of the failure of patience, and I would have reason to think about it later. The summer had been drier than normal, which meant the creek bed was low and the limestone shelf was more exposed than it typically was, and this is the kind of thing that a person reading weather as a signal rather than an inconvenience takes note of. The low water had left flat courses of stone accessible that, in a normal summer, would have sat under 2 feet of current, and some of those courses were 3 and 4 inches thick with a face dimension that was nearly ideal for dry stacked work, broad enough to carry the weight of the next course without rocking, and long enough to tie back into the wall and resist lateral pressure. I know this now because she explained it to me over the course of about 4 conversations that fall, standing at the wall while she worked. And I learned more about the physics of dry stacked limestone in those conversations than I had absorbed in 4 decades of living next to the material. She had done her reading. She had gone to the county library and found 3 monographs on dry stone construction, 2 of them British and 1 of them published by a university press in the late 1960s, and she had read them with a pencil in her hand, and she had gone back to Vera's page and compared the language until she understood what her grandmother had understood. 9 degrees of batter means the face of the wall leans back 9 degrees from vertical into the prevailing wind, so that the wall does not push back against the force but absorbs it and sheds it upward and over. It is a very old principle. It was old when Vera wrote about it. She had not invented it. She had only recognized it and written it down for whoever came after, which turned out to be the granddaughter she had not yet had when she wrote the words. She started stacking the first week of October, and she worked until the ground froze in late November, and she worked again from the first thaw in March through June of 1988, and then again through the following fall. She hauled, by her own count kept in a pocket notebook she carried in her barn coat, 214 loads of limestone from the creek bed to the building site over 14 months. Not 214 tons. 214 loads, each one weighed and recorded, averaging just under 1.5 tons per run, which works out to approximately 320 tons of stone moved by one woman in a borrowed truck and stacked by hand without mortar or machinery. The wall, when she finished it, ran 282 feet along the north face of the main barn and the equipment shed and turned 90 degrees at each end to provide returns of 31 feet. It stood 6 feet 10 inches at its lowest point and 7 feet 4 inches at its highest. The batter was, she told me when it was done, within a degree of what Vera had specified, which she had measured with a bevel gauge and a level every 20 courses. She was 33 years old when she finished it, and she looked, when she showed it to me, the morning she drove the last stake to mark the footer, like a person who has completed exactly what they set out to do, and is not surprised by this. Denton came by in the fall of 1988 after the wall was finished, and he stood at it for a long moment, and then he said it was a lot of rock to move without help. He said it the way people out here say something that is both an observation and a concession, without quite being either one. She thanked him. He drove on. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. I want to tell you what I did not tell you yet about that October morning in 1987, the morning she brought up the first load from the creek bed, and I watched her come up the hill with the limestone on the bed of my father's old truck. What I did not tell you is that I had walked that north fence line myself maybe a dozen times over the years, and I had looked at the same exposure she was looking at, and I had thought, more than once, something like what Vera had written, something like, a person could put a stone structure here that would change the way the wind behaves against that barn. I had thought it the way you think things at a fence line, loosely and without committing, the way a man sometimes sees a true thing clearly and then puts it away, because acting on it would require a kind of patience he is not yet prepared to demonstrate. I put that thought away every time. She picked it up and built 320 tons of it. I tell you that because it is the honest version, and the honest version is the only one worth the telling. The county had a soil conservationist, a woman who had done her doctoral work on microclimate effects in agricultural settings, and she came out in the spring of 1989 to look at the wall for a project she was doing on wind management structures on small operations. She walked the length of the wall twice, took measurements, and then stood on the lee side of it with her hand flat against the stone for a moment before she said anything. What she said eventually was that the batter specification was exceptional, and that she had not seen hand-stacked limestone executed at this tolerance on a working farm in the region. She said exceptional the way engineers say it when they mean it, which is without embellishment, and then she asked if she could photograph it for the project. She used 2 of those photographs in the published paper, which came out the following year. The caption on the first photograph read, "Dry stacked limestone windbreak, private farm, northeast face orientation, constructed by owner 1987 to 1988. It did not say that the specification had come from a notebook written by a woman nearly 50 years before in pencil that had gone brown with time. It did not say that. But the wall itself said it, if you knew how to read stone. Now I need to tell you about the February of 1990, because that is when the rest of the story stopped being a story about stubbornness and patience and became a story about the difference between a problem and a lesson, depending on whether you were paying attention. The winter had been unremarkable up to that point, which out here means it had been cold, in the way that cold is supposed to be, cold, steady, and gray, and honest, not brutal in the way that makes the news, but demanding in the way that puts the real pressure on structures and livestock and the joints of anyone past 50. We had gotten ice in late January, a half-inch coat on everything, and then it had cleared, and the temperature had dropped and held, and by the first week of February, the forecast was running numbers that were serious, even by the standards of a region that takes its winters seriously. The storm came in on a Thursday morning, which I remember, because I had been planning to drive to the feed supplier on Wednesday and had postponed it, one of those decisions you make on vague instinct, and then feel either foolish or prescient about afterward. And by Wednesday evening, I was watching the western sky and deciding I'd been prescient. It came out of the northwest, the way the serious ones always do, and it carried wind that the Weather Service eventually measured at sustained 41 miles per hour with gusts to 63. And it carried with it an ice load in the first 3 hours that was unlike anything I had seen in 40 years of watching that particular sky. Not snow with ice in it, ice. The kind that builds on a horizontal surface faster than you can watch and builds on a vertical surface faster than you can believe, and the kind that tests every structure that was ever built with the implicit assumption that the force it would face in its lifetime would be reasonable. 7 roofs in the county came off or came apart in that storm. 7. I knew 4 of the farms that took damage, and I knew the structures, and none of them were poorly built. The equipment shed at the Halverson place lost its entire north wall and 2 bays of roofing. The farrowing barn at the Creel operation, which had been standing since 1961 and had been maintained properly, lost the north slope of its roof completely, and Denton, whose truck never had mud in the wheel wells, and who had told her in April of 1987 that she ought to think about what the property was worth, lost the lean-to addition on the north side of his main barn, all 40 feet of it, in about 11 seconds. I know about the 11 seconds because he told me, later, in the flat way people describe things they watched and could not stop. He said it went like that, quick and complete, and he stood there in the wind and the ice and watched it go. Her barn was untouched. Her equipment shed was untouched. The wall took the force the way Vera had said it would, and the way the British monographs described, and the way she had built it to do, and on the lee side of that wall, the morning after the storm, the ice was lighter by more than half compared to what was on the north-facing surfaces of every unprotected structure nearby. I walked it myself. I pressed my hand against the barn wall on the protected side, and then walked around to where the full exposure began past the end of the return wall, and I felt the difference the way you feel the difference when you step out of shade into sun, sudden and complete, and requiring no instrument to measure. The wall had created a zone of relative calm against the barn face that extended, by my rough estimation, roughly 12 to 15 feet out from the base, and in that zone the ice had not bonded to the barn siding the way it had bonded everywhere else. The roof was clean, the siding was tight, the animals were dry. I stood at that wall for a long time that morning. The storm had blown through and the sky had gone the pale washed blue that follows a serious weather event out here, the kind of blue that is almost an apology, and it was cold, probably 5 degrees with a chill still working out of the northwest. And I stood at that wall and I thought about Vera writing in the composition book in 1939 or 1940, or whenever she had written that page, writing it in pencil in a cedar chest for a granddaughter she did not yet have. And I thought about the 14 months of limestone and the bevel gauge and the 214 loads on my father's old truck. And I thought about the 7 roofs in the county and Denton's 11 seconds, and I thought, the field doesn't care who believes in it. That is the phrase that came to me standing at that wall in the 5-degree morning in February of 1990. And it is the truest thing I have carried out of this whole story. The field does not care who believes in it. The wall does not care who doubted the woman who built it. The wind tested the county's structures without any interest in whose judgment had been correct, and the one that held was the one built to Vera's specification by a woman who had the patience not to rush the base. She still farms that 80 acres. She is 69 years old now, and the wall is 37 years old, and it has not moved. I have watched stone structures fail in this climate, and I know what that looks like. The courses that begin to lean, the faces that begin to spall under freeze-thaw cycling, the bases that begin to settle when the drainage beneath them is not right. This wall has done none of that. The batter has remained within a degree of true. I walked it with her 2 falls ago, both of us slower than we were in 1987, and neither of us saying much about that. And I ran my hand along the face of it the way I do sometimes when I pass it, and the stone is tight, the way stone is tight, when it was laid with patience and understanding, and when the person doing the laying had read the ground correctly before she ever set the first course. I asked her once, maybe 1994 or 1995, whether she had ever doubted the wall while she was building it during the 14 months of hauling and stacking, whether there had been a morning when the distance between the first course and the finished wall felt unreasonable. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had doubted it once, in November of 1987, when the ground had frozen early and she'd had to stop for the season with the wall only at 3 feet and the returns not yet started. And she'd stood there looking at 3 feet of limestone going nowhere in particular, and thought about all the things she could have done with 14 months of Tuesday and Saturday mornings. And then, she said, she went inside and read Vera's page again. She said she read it the way you reread a letter from someone who is gone and who knew more than they were given credit for while they were alive. She said after she read it, she went to bed and slept without difficulty. I believe her. That is exactly how you do it. There is a thing my own father used to say about structures, and I have thought about it in relation to this wall more than in relation to anything else he applied it to. He used to say, build it for the worst day you can imagine, and then build it for the day after that. He meant it literally the way farmers usually mean the things they say about structures, without metaphor and without apology. But I have come to hear something else in it too, something about the way a woman reads a dead woman's notebook and borrows a truck with a cracked mirror and hauls 320 tons of limestone in 14 months without anyone's permission or approval, building for a storm she cannot know is coming, but trusts is coming, because the ground has always told the truth about what it will eventually ask of the things built on it. Build it for the worst day you can imagine, and then build it for the day after that. Vera wrote it in the notebook. The granddaughter built it in the stone. The storm in February of 1990 was the worst day. The 5-degree blue morning after, with the barn roof clean and the animals dry, and 7 other roofs gone somewhere into the fields, was the day after. The wall held for both of them. The soil conservationist's paper cited an estimated wind load reduction of 62% on the immediate lee face of a properly battered dry stone structure compared to an unprotected vertical surface of equivalent dimension under the same weather event. 62%. That number is from her measurements, from her instruments, from her published work, and it is not a number you can argue with the way you can argue with a neighbor's hunch or a younger farmer's stubbornness. The extension agent who had come out in October of 1987 with his clipboard had quoted a number of his own, which was the estimated material and labor cost of the steel windscreen panels he was recommending, which was somewhere around $4,200 at 1987 prices, installed, with a 15 to 20-year lifespan before the panel anchors began to fail in this soil. I want to be fair to that number because it was a real number and a real recommendation, and not an unreasonable one. But the wall is 37 years old, and the panels would have needed replacing twice by now, possibly 3 times, and the wall has never needed anything except the occasional reset of a single face stone after a severe ice year, which takes an afternoon and costs nothing but the time. The limestone came from the creek bed on the property. It cost exactly what the diesel cost to run my father's truck. The wall is still there. I want to tell you one more thing about the notebook because I think it is the most important part, and I have been building toward it since the beginning, and I want to give it the room it deserves. When she showed me the 43rd page that June at the fence line, she had the notebook open to it, and I read it standing there in the early summer with the creek audible in the distance and the smell of new growth on everything. I read the 2 underlined lines and the question mark in the margin, and I thought about Vera, who I had never met but whose husband Harold I had known, and I thought about what it means to write a thing down for someone you will never meet, someone who will need the answer to a question you yourself never resolved because the life got in the way, or the season changed, or the winters ran out before the patience did. Vera had never built the wall. She had understood it completely, had worked out the specification, had written it down with the care of someone who believed it mattered, and had not built it. The question mark was not doubt. It was an offering. She was leaving the question open for the person who would come after and have the winter to do it right. And the person who came after had the winter and the patience and the borrowed truck and the 214 loads and the bevel gauge and Vera's page. The field doesn't care who believes in it, but the person who builds on it, the person who reads the notebook by the barn light and measures the batter every 20 courses and drives up the hill in October with the first 1.5 tons of creek limestone on a cracked mirror flatbed, that person gets to stand in the 5-degree morning after the storm and press her hand against the dry wall of an untouched barn and know something the rest of us were still learning. She knew it the whole time. She just needed the stone to prove it. I have thought about what I would have done with that notebook if I had been the one to find it, and I have been honest enough with myself about the answer to know that I probably would have read it once and put it back in the cedar chest and found good reasons to do something else with the next 14 months. I say that not to be hard on myself, but to tell the truth about what patience costs and why it is not as common as we pretend it is. It costs you the certainty of knowing you're right before the evidence is in. It costs you the comfort of doing what everyone around you recognizes as sensible. It costs you 14 months of Tuesday and Saturday mornings when the weather is cold and the rock is heavy and the wall is at 3 feet, and going nowhere you can see yet. Most of us, most of the time, will spend that 14 months differently. She didn't. And that is the whole of why the roof was there in the morning, and the barn was dry, and the animals were calm, and why Vera's question mark finally got its answer. If you have ever read a thing left behind by someone who knew the ground before you did, and then gone and done it the slow and heavy way, because the note said to, and been right about it, in a way you could not prove until the worst day arrived, I would like to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what you built and what it held against. And if this story meant something to you, if it sounded like something you have felt standing at your own fence line on a gray October morning, subscribe. Because that is the kind of conversation I am trying to have. And I would rather have it with people who understand what it means to move 300 tons of something one load at a time, because a woman in 1940 wrote it down in pencil and left the question open.